Sabine, in 2011, you had your first near-death experience. How did it come about, and what did you experience? Well, at that time, I had set out to seek for more authentic spirituality on my path through life. As a child, I was raised a Roman Catholic, and very rigorously, but by and by I lost my belief in this religion. But then in January 2011, I found my way back to my Christian faith, but I had problems coping with the image of God as a vengeful judge, as well as with the dogma of eternal suffering in hell. For me, this was inconsistent with the words of the Bible, that God is love. When dealing with these thoughts, it suddenly came to my mind that we humans could be these fallen angels, as is mentioned in the Bible, and that in a constantly recurring cycle of life and death, each individual soul can be redeemed by its mysterious destinies, until a soul is finally allowed someday to return to its original spiritual home. Shortly thereafter, I came across Origen, and I also have found the scripts of Jacob Lorber, thereby finding exactly this idea confirmed. And this made me enthusiastic, and it transported me almost into a state of enlightenment, which resulted in an expansion of consciousness. One can imagine that suddenly the two major forces, material and spiritual, began to merge with each other. I cannot find the words to describe how suddenly the spiritual sphere was as equally real for me as was the earthly material sphere. And this impression has become even more intense during the day and in the evening. At that time, I still owned a horse. So one day I went into the stable in order to clean it, thereby realizing that even my horse may have had this perception. Because the horse was downright crazy beside me, and unable to understand all this, I started to get frightened. I went home, and later that evening, I went to bed. I was really scared because I got the feeling I had made a mistake. And then I sat up in bed, holding the Bible firmly in my hands, and suddenly everything around me seemed to be black. Then I saw a light in the distance, very far away, a source of light, and suddenly I found myself inside a kind of tunnel, moving toward this light. And having reached the light, I was completely enshrouded in it. And then this light took the shape of a hall, or you might say a very large room. What I can still remember is that I saw big windows to my right, kind of arched windows, without panes, but nevertheless I could see the blue sky outside, as well as very intense colors, quite different from the ones in our world. And the hall was radiating out of itself, and in front of me there was still the light. And I can remember that I was asking myself where I was, and what on earth was going on here. And if I had died, could this be heaven? And where are all these beings, usually surrounding the throne of God? I did not perceive anything other than the light, and I was alone in the hall with the light, and it drew me to it like magic. This light was radiating a tremendous love and an exceptional warmth in my soul. And suddenly I heard a voice inside me giving me a message, which was telepathic in nature, because I did not hear this with my physical ears. It was my soul which had received this message, and the voice said that I had taken the right path, and also that I would have to be given a new name. Whereas I answered in a childlike and naive manner, why should I receive a new name? I already have a name. What does that mean? What's the point of all this? Then I felt how I was somehow drawn back again into the tunnel by means of a kind of elastic band, and everything around me seemed to be black once again. So I went back into my body. I was still sitting in bed, bolt upright, and still holding the Bible in my hands. First I thought that I was only dreaming. Then I asked myself what kind of dream this might have been. But actually, it was not like a dream, because it was so real. And then I laid down to sleep. What impact did this experience have on your future life? The next morning I woke up unable to forget this supposed dream, and it kept me very occupied. I then searched the internet, and very quickly I came across near-death experiences. Previously, I had always thought that near-death experiences only occurred in connection with a life-threatening incident. But according to what I read, near-death experiences also result from expanding consciousness, or a shocking experience, or even while asleep. That was the first time it happened to me, that I had such an experience. Expansion of consciousness did not cease, but even became more intense. And around noon, I suddenly had very strange thoughts. These were quite horrendous thoughts. I really didn't know what was happening, and I couldn't believe it. These were blasphemous words and thoughts, and finally I got scared. For a moment, I was unable to put a stop to these wicked thoughts. There was no way. They even grew in strength, and in my distress, I started to say the Lord's Prayer, because this was the only thing I could think of at that point. And in so doing, I was able to banish these voices inside me, as well as these quite unholy thoughts. But they kept recurring, more or less intense. But I had at least the tool to protect myself, namely knowing which measures to take against these phenomena. Well, suddenly I became clairvoyant. I saw spirit beings as well as nebulous structures floating around in the room. I heard spirit beings talking to each other, also in dialogues with one another. I also developed pronounced clairsentient abilities, which have quite sustainably influenced my life, and I became more and more aware that a new dimension had been opened for me, to the extent that I could no longer live the way I had been living. Tell me, later on you had yet another near-death experience which was rather unpleasant for you. Well, yes, my antenna for the fine spiritual vibration have been refined more and more. At that time, I had a friend going through a dramatic, negative personality change, at least in my opinion. So I tried to help him because I assumed that he was being manipulated by some evil spirits. So I downloaded a prayer of salvation from the internet, and I said this prayer for him, but without previously asking his consent. He didn't know about this. So in the evening I went to bed, and I suddenly found myself in a similar situation as before, because suddenly it seemed to be dark around me again. But this time I was not moving toward the light, but went down into a dark, cold tunnel. And I was scared. Suddenly, I found myself in a rocky area, completely littered with rocks, and there I was climbing around, looking for this person. But I didn't find him. Suddenly, it started to rain, and down in the valley, I saw a small light source. And quick as a flash, I was there, where I found myself standing in front of a small cottage, comparable to a mountain hut. I opened the door and entered the cottage, and then I saw that it was quite dark there. But nevertheless, I saw all the contents which were important for me. In the middle of the cottage, there was a kind of crossbeam on which a creature was sitting, a being which was laughing at me. I was completely shocked, because this creature was of an incredible ugliness, as I have never before seen, and it was just laughing at me with malicious pleasure. I was so shocked and almost unable to move, and suddenly I felt something warm and wet running down my body. And then I realized that this dreadful creature was peeing and defecating on me. I was disgusted and really shocked, and suddenly I was drawn back again into the dark tunnel by means of an elastic cord. And then I woke up in my body, sitting bolt upright in my bed, drenched in sweat and totally terrified. This experience had a strong impact on me, and as a result of it, my clairvoyant and clairsentient perceptions, which I described before, intensified. How did this experience affect your life? For me, things really could not go on as they were. I had massive problems. Therapy was recommended, but I stopped it because I was unable to discuss my problems. I couldn't speak about these problems with anyone for fear of being thought to be insane. For me, though, all this was quite real, and as a consequence of this, I became seriously ill. Nevertheless, I looked for solutions to escape this dilemma. How did you manage to get out of this difficult life situation? I started to cope with my life problems. This was the summer of 2012. I saw some people go through a life review during their near-death experience, and that's the way it was for me, with the difference that in my case, this happened in the real world. I was shown everything I experienced during my life, everything that was done to me, and also what I did to others. This did not happen in an instant, but during 2 or 3 years. Well, first I had to forgive many people, but I had to ask many more people for forgiveness. And I wrote letters to people I could not reach, and thereafter I burned these letters. Well, there were, with no exaggeration, around 3,000 letters, which I wrote during 2 or 3 years. And in this way, I was able, step by step, to expiate my sins. And after a while, I felt relieved. Later on, you had an out-of-body experience. Yes, that's true. This was after having worked on the issue of my grandparents. One afternoon, I was tired and wanted to have a rest, so I lay down and had a nap. Suddenly, I felt how my soul left my body, which was a rather strange procedure, because it was not a normal mechanism of getting out of the body, but I was folded up and pulled up like a board. And then I was floating through the door, thereupon down and through the hall, then through the ceiling, into the kitchen, on the lower floor. And in my kitchen there was an oven at that time, equipped with a glass window, where my face was reflected in this glass window, when suddenly my face started to change and other faces suddenly appeared. And I had the feeling that these faces came out of me, and suddenly there were 4 spirit beings, or 4 figures behind me. And I don't know why I thereupon went into the bathroom, and these beings followed me. There was a funny story with the bathroom. It was very small and narrow, very small, and suddenly it expanded, so that there was enough space for all of us. In the bathroom, there was a bathtub, and inside this bathtub, there was a young man who was totally indignant that he was still alive. You mean a spirit being? Yes, as a spirit being. And he did not know what had happened to him, nor did he know what would happen, as he had committed suicide. And he wasn't happy he was still alive. And he did not understand this because he thought that after death all would be over, and now life went on. There were also two elderly gentlemen there, wearing quite antiquated suits, like people dressed 100 or 150 years ago. They both were in front of me. One of them was sitting on the toilet lid, the other one was standing beside him, and I was communicating with them. But I don't remember exactly what really was the point, but I think it was not that important. Furthermore, my grandfather was present. I was sitting on his lap, and he was speaking of something, and I could identify him, particularly by his dialect, which formerly was spoken by the elderly people of our village, which is a quite peculiar, special dialect, and he was using words which only he always used. So I just knew that he was my grandfather. Then I asked him if he had seen my grandmother, whereupon he did not answer. And I thought this was weird, and suddenly the bathroom door opened, and my eldest daughter entered the bathroom. She headed for the medicine cabinet, opened it, rummaged in it for something, then left the bathroom and closed the door. And then once again, I experienced being drawn back by an elastic cord. Again, I was floating through the ceiling and through the door, and then I went back into my body. Nonetheless, it was completely different this time. My body was as heavy as lead. I could hardly move. I could hardly stand up. It was really very strange. Well, this experience was so extraordinary that I wrote it down, and I really didn't tell anyone about it. What was very far-reaching for me was that my clairvoyance, as well as my clairaudience, were gone after this experience. What remained was clairsentience, but the other abilities were suddenly gone. And in this way, calm was restored to me, at least in this connection. Tell me, did your daughter enter the bathroom as a human being? Yes, she came into the bathroom as a human being. And I found out later that she indeed was in the bathroom at that exact same time. And how did your view of the world change after all these incredible perceptions of the spirit and exceptional experiences? Afterwards, I was much more indulgent with my fellow men, whereas previously I had to really exert myself to forgive people. Now this is much easier for me. Previously, I practiced a deep-seated hatred against myself as well as self-destruction, whereas today I have a positive approach to life. I also try to reduce prejudice and condemnation, and I also try to judge other people less. And sometimes more and sometimes less, I succeed in doing so. And all adversity in my life, in particular after the spiritual insight I have gradually gained, became a blessing for me and form the basis for me as the human being I am today, as well as for my activities today. Thank you very much for the interview. You are quite welcome.